His wife handed him a bucket, pointed at her boyfriend's car sitting in the driveway of the house he paid for, and told him to make it shine, while her mother and her brother sat at the table inside and laughed. What none of them knew was that 3 days earlier that same quiet man had signed an $82 billion energy deal. What none of them knew was that the boyfriend's car, the one he was washing on his knees on a Sunday afternoon, belonged to a man whose entire fortune depended on a signature only that quiet man could provide. And what none of them knew was that he had already decided to stop providing it. The question isn't whether he got his revenge. The question is how completely and how quietly a man with that kind of power can dismantle the world of people who never bothered to learn what he was worth. If this story is already hitting different, go ahead and tap that like button right now. It tells us you want more stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we drop new stories every week and you do not want to miss what's coming. And drop your city in the comments. Where are you watching from today? We love seeing where our community is listening from around the world. Now let me take you back to where this all started. Back to a Thanksgiving Sunday in New Orleans, a driveway, a bucket of soapy water, and a man who said absolutely nothing because he already knew exactly what was coming next. The Sunday after Thanksgiving, the churro house smelled like sweet potato pie and old money that wasn't as old as Sylvia liked to pretend. The extended family had taken over every room the way they always did. Cousins Raymond couldn't name filling plates in the kitchen, aunts staking claims on the good chairs in the living room, the television loud with a game nobody was actually watching. Raymond had cooked that morning, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, cornbread from scratch, a peach cobbler cooling on the counter that Sylvia would eat 2 helpings of without acknowledging he made it. That was the rhythm of this house. Raymond provided, the Thoreaus received, nobody said thank you, and nobody was expected to. He was standing near the hallway when the black Suburban pulled into the driveway. He watched through the front window as Dominique moved to the door before the engine cut off. Not a walk, a glide, the kind of movement a woman makes when she has been anticipating something. She opened the front door herself, which she had not done for Raymond in years, and her whole body changed when Bryce Fontenot stepped out of that truck. She laughed at something he said before he reached the porch steps. It was the laugh Raymond used to know. Bryce Fontenot was a broad-shouldered man in a salmon-colored shirt, the kind of man who believed his own entrance. He shook hands with André like they had met before, which they clearly had, and he kissed Sylvia on the cheek while she held his arm with both hands like he was something she had ordered and was pleased to receive. Raymond stayed near the hallway. Nobody introduced him. He did not move forward to introduce himself. Dominique found him eventually, the way you find furniture, without really looking. She crossed the room holding a red plastic cup and stopped in front of him with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite contempt, but lived comfortably between the two. She held out the bucket. It was the yellow one from under the kitchen sink. She had already put dish soap in it, which meant she had planned this before Bryce arrived, which meant this was not an impulse. She held it at arm's length, looked directly at Raymond, and smiled with her eyes flat. "His car is dusty from the drive," she said. "Handle that." The living room was not loud enough that people did not hear her. Sylvia's voice came from the good chair by the window, carrying the particular satisfaction of a woman who had been waiting 11 years for a moment like this one. "Good," she said, to no one and everyone. "He's being useful for once." André laughed from somewhere near the television. Raymond heard the small sound of a phone camera clicking on. Raymond looked at Dominique for one long moment. He took the bucket. He walked through the front door without a word, without a change in his expression, without anything that could be read as shame or anger or defeat, because none of those things were what he was feeling. What he was feeling was something much quieter and much more final, but he had no interest in showing that to anyone in that room. Outside, the afternoon had gone cool and grey the way New Orleans afternoons do in late November, that particular damp chill that gets into the collar of your jacket. Raymond turned the hose on and worked methodically the way he did everything. Front panels first, then the hood, then back around to the rear. He was not thinking about Dominique. He was not thinking about Sylvia or Andre or the sound of that laugh from inside the house. He was thinking about the paper in his jacket pocket. It was folded twice, standard letter size, the kind of document that looked like nothing particular from the outside. He had signed it Wednesday morning in a conference room in Baton Rouge with Crescent Continental Energy's lead counsel sitting across the table and 3 junior attorneys who kept glancing at each other like they couldn't quite believe the number on the page. $82 billion in Gulf deepwater development rights. The largest privately held deepwater lease transaction in Louisiana history, the lead counsel had said, and then cleared his throat like the words surprised even him. Raymond had signed where indicated, capped the pen, and thanked them for their time. He crouched now to work the soapy sponge along the running board of the Suburban, and that was when he saw them. Survey maps. Rolled loosely and stacked across the back seat, the kind of large format prints that came off a plotter, the kind Raymond had been producing for 9 years. He could see the grid lines, the parcel boundaries, the depth notations along the coastal margins. He leaned slightly closer without touching the glass. In the lower left corner of the top map, in handwriting he would have recognized anywhere, because it was his own, were the notation marks he used to flag disputed boundary coordinates. His personal shorthand. Nobody else used that system. Those were Holloway Trust surveys. Crescent Continental had distributed them to their regional subcontractors during diligence, which meant Bryce Fontenot, the man currently sitting in Raymond's living room eating Raymond's cobbler, the man whose car Raymond was washing in Raymond's driveway, had been handed documents that existed because of Raymond's 7 years of quiet, methodical, unpaid work on land that Raymond alone controlled. Raymond's phone buzzed twice in his pocket. He silenced it without looking. He finished the car. He dried the panels with the chamois from under the bucket. He coiled the hose back on its hook by the garage door and set the bucket down with the same unhurried steadiness that had carried him through 11 years in this family. Then he went back inside and ate 2 pieces of peach cobbler and did not say a single word for the rest of the afternoon. To understand Raymond Holloway, you have to understand where he came from. Pointe Coupé Parish was not the kind of place that produced men who announced themselves. It produced men who showed up early, worked past dark, and let the quality of what they built speak for everything they couldn't say out loud. Raymond's father had been a carpenter. His grandfather before that had worked timber. Raymond had come up watching men measure twice and cut once, and that discipline had settled into him like a second skeleton. He became a land surveyor because it suited him perfectly. Work that required patience, precision, and the ability to read land the way other men read faces. He met Dominique Thureau at a fundraiser for a church auxiliary in New Orleans, the spring he turned 32. She was beautiful in the specific way of a woman who had been told so her entire life and had organized her expectations accordingly. She laughed easily that evening, touched his arm when she talked, and looked at him like he was something worth discovering. He was not a man who fell quickly, but he fell completely. He did not understand at first what he was marrying into. The Turauds were a particular kind of New Orleans family, old Creole bloodlines, the kind that kept a family Bible with names going back to the 1800s and referred to it in conversation as if it were a financial document. Sylvia Turreau ran the family with the quiet authority of a woman who believed that social position was a form of moral achievement. She had opinions about neighborhoods, about professions, about the cut of a man's suit, and what it communicated about his prospects. Raymond, from Pointe-Coupé, with his surveyor's truck and his practical hands and his accent that still curved around the vowels of the parish he grew up in, did not fit any category Sylvia considered acceptable. She told Dominique this at the engagement dinner. She said it quietly, the way she said most cruel things, leaning close to her daughter, while Raymond was in the kitchen refilling his glass. Raymond didn't hear the words, he heard the tone. He filed it away and said nothing. The wedding was small. The house came 2 years later. Raymond found the property himself. A 4-bedroom in Metairie, solid bones, good lot, a yard big enough for the family he still believed they might build. He paid the down payment from his savings and carried the mortgage on his income alone, because Dominique's marketing salary went toward the life she wanted to maintain, the clothes, the dinners, the contribution to Sylvia's Heritage Society events. Raymond didn't complain about that either. He was building something, he told himself. That's what men from his parish did. The closing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Raymond was called out to a job site in St. Mary Parish the night before, a surveying dispute that needed resolution before a construction deadline. He drove 4 hours each way, worked through the night, and called Dominique from a gas station at 6 in the morning to say he might not make the closing in time. Dominique told him not to worry. She told him Sylvia would go with her to handle the paperwork. He trusted her. He did not see the deed until 3 weeks later, when he was filing the mortgage documents. His name was not on it. Dominique Turreau Holloway, sole owner. He asked Dominique about it that evening, and she told him it had been a clerical matter, that Sylvia's attorney had advised it, something about liability protection, nothing to worry about. Raymond looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, and went to his home office and sat in the dark for a while. He did not raise it again. What followed was 8 years of a particular kind of erosion. Not sudden, not dramatic, just steady, incremental, like water working on limestone. Raymond's income paid the mortgage, the utilities, the grocery bills, the repairs when the water heater failed, and when the back fence blew down in a storm. His name appeared on none of the documents. He was the financial foundation of a household that had been legally constructed to exclude him. Dominique stopped bringing him to the Greater Harvest Fellowship events sometime around year 4. She told people at her work functions that she was married, but the pause before "my husband" grew longer each year, as if she were reaching for a word she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to use. At Sylvia's Christmas gatherings, Raymond sat at the end of the table nearest the kitchen, closest to the food, and furthest from the conversation. Andre borrowed $7,000 the first time, in year 3. He said it was for a business opportunity, didn't offer details, never mentioned repayment. He borrowed $7,000 more in year 5 with the same ease, the ease of a man who had correctly identified that Raymond would not make a scene. Raymond gave it both times without comment. He kept a record in a notebook in his desk drawer. He was the kind of man who kept records. In year 8, on a Wednesday evening in November, Dominique sat across from Raymond at the kitchen table and told him plainly that she had settled. She said she had been talking to someone. She did not name Bryce, not yet, but the implication carried its own weight, and that she deserved more than Raymond had ever been able to give her. She said she needed someone with vision. someone who moved in the world with ambition she could point to. Raymond listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he stood up, carried his plate to the sink, washed it, dried it, and put it back in the cabinet. Then he went to his home office and closed the door behind him. What Dominique never knew was that on the other side of that door, Raymond had been quietly building something that would dwarf everything the Turreau family had ever claimed to own. Celeste Fontenot's office was on the 4th floor of a building on 3rd Street in Baton Rouge, the kind of building that had no sign out front because the people who needed to find it already knew where it was. Raymond drove up from New Orleans on the Monday morning after Thanksgiving, left before the sun was fully up, and arrived with a paper cup of coffee and nothing else. He had not slept particularly well. He had not told anyone where he was going. Celeste was already at her desk when her assistant showed him in. She was a compact woman in her early 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a desk covered in organized stacks that only she could navigate. She had represented Raymond since the early days of the trust work, back when the Holloway land was still something most people would have dismissed as a surveying project with no commercial future. She had never dismissed it. That was why he had hired her. She gestured to the chair across from her and pulled a thick folder to the center of the desk. "I want to show you the full picture," she said. "All of it, consolidated. I don't think you've seen it laid out this way before." Raymond sat down and set his coffee cup on the edge of her desk. He nodded once. Celeste opened the folder and began. The Holloway Land Trust, as it stood following the executed term sheet, represented a controlling interest in 290,000 acres of coastal Louisiana and deep-water mineral claims now under development agreement with Crescent Continental Energy. The deal structure valued Raymond's trustee position and primary beneficiary interest at a figure that Celeste wrote on a legal pad and slid across the desk without announcing it aloud. Raymond looked at it. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked back at Celeste. "That's the floor," she said. "Royalty distributions begin in the 2nd quarter. The ceiling depends on production yield, but Crescent Continental's internal projections are conservative by design." Raymond nodded slowly. He already knew the broad numbers. What he had not seen was what came next. Celeste turned to the 2nd section of the folder. Fontenot Gulf Partners, she explained, held a $67 million subcontract with Crescent Continental tied specifically to the Holloway Trust Development Agreement. The subcontract covered regional site preparation and infrastructure coordination across 4 coastal parishes. It was a substantial contract, albeit the kind that could support a mid-sized development firm for 3 years of comfortable operation. The contract contained a standard trustee cooperation clause, which was boilerplate in agreements of this type, requiring the land trust's ongoing authorization for any ground-level activity within the trust boundary. Raymond was the trustee. He sat with that for a moment. He thought about the salmon-colored shirt. He thought about Dominique gliding to the door before the engine cut off. "He doesn't know," Raymond said. "He has no reason to," Celeste said. "The subcontract runs through Crescent Continental. Fontenot Gulf Partners has never had direct contact with the trust." Celeste moved to the 3rd section. The Turreau family's commercial building on Poydras Street in New Orleans, the one Sylvia referenced at family dinners like it was a dynasty asset, had been purchased 4 years ago using a construction loan co-signed against Dominique's property in Metairie. The guarantee documentation listed a secondary real estate holding in St. James Parish as collateral. Celeste had pulled the property record. That St. James parcel sat inside the Holloway Trust's surface rights boundary. Raymond was still. "Which means the loan guarantee," he said. is encumbered, Celeste confirmed. Any lender conducting a standard title review would flag it. The commercial building's financing is resting on ground your trust controls. Raymond picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking. Celeste opened the final section. The Louisiana Coastal Heritage Society, she said, had received its operating endowment grant 3 years prior through Crescent Continental's Community Investment Foundation. The grant totaled $420,000, disbursed annually in installments. The grant documentation contained a community partnership clause requiring annual trustee certification from the Holloway Land Trust, confirming continued cooperation with coastal development activities in the affected parishes. The certification was Raymond's to give or withhold. Without it, the next disbursement would not release. Raymond set the folder down on the desk carefully, the way a man sets down something that has just changed its weight. He looked at the wall behind Celeste for a moment, then back at her. He thought about Sylvia in her good chair by the window, her voice carrying across the living room with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting a long time to say exactly what she said. He thought about the Heritage Society chairmanship she mentioned at every gathering, every church auxiliary meeting, every holiday table, like it was evidence of something permanent. "How long," he said, "would it take to initiate a surface rights review on the trust parcels?" Celeste did not hesitate. 72 hours for the first formal notices to land. Raymond was quiet for a long moment. "Give me 1 week," he said. Celeste looked at him steadily. She had known Raymond Holloway for 7 years. She had watched him spend those years doing meticulous, unannounced work on land that nobody else believed in. She understood what 1 week meant. She closed the folder. He spent that week watching and deciding exactly how much of his patience he was willing to spend. Raymond drove back to New Orleans that Monday with the windows down, the late November air cold and damp off the river, and his mind running through everything Celeste had shown him with the precise, methodical clarity of a man who had spent his career measuring things exactly. He did not feel rage. He had used up whatever rage he had in year 3 and year 5 and year 8, in all the quiet rooms where he had absorbed what the Turreau family handed him and said nothing. What he felt now was something colder and more useful. He felt the particular focus of a man who had finally decided to stop waiting. He called Celeste the next morning. They met at her office again on Tuesday, and this time Raymond came with questions rather than patience. He wanted to understand the sequence, not just that the dominoes existed, but exactly what order they needed to fall and how many days between each one. Celeste had a yellow legal pad. She drew a vertical line down the center and wrote names on the left and consequences on the right, and they worked through it together like they were reading a survey map. First, the surface rights review. That was the trigger for everything else. Once Celeste filed the formal initiation with the parish recorder's office, Crescent Continental would be legally obligated to halt ground activity on all affected parcels pending resolution. Fontenot Gulf Partners' construction authorization would freeze within 72 hours. The $67 million subcontract would go into suspension the moment construction halted, because the subcontract was tied to active site work, not to future promises. 3 to 5 days after that, the title encumbrance would surface in the lender's routine monitoring of the Turreau commercial property guarantee. A lender didn't need to be told. Their title insurance carrier would flag it automatically. The margin call would follow. 5 days after that, the Heritage Society's next disbursement would be due. Celeste would send a letter to Crescent Continental's Community Foundation advising that trustee certification for the current grant period could not be provided. The disbursement would not release Sylvia would receive a formal inquiry from her own board, 3 distinct strikes, 3 to 5 days apart, each one landing before the previous one was resolved. Raymond listened to all of it, then told Celeste one thing clearly. He wanted his name on every document, not anonymous tips, not third-party notices with the trust's name buried in the fine print. His name, Raymond Holloway, trustee, Holloway Land Trust, on the signature line of every piece of paper that moved through this process. He had spent 11 years being the invisible financial foundation of other people's positions. That was finished. He was done being invisible. Celeste looked at him over her glasses and said that was not a problem. That was, in fact, his right. She filed the Surface Rights Review initiation on Friday afternoon. On Wednesday of that same week, Raymond had driven across town to the office of a divorce attorney named Harlan Webb, a separate matter entirely from Celeste, kept deliberately separate, and spent 90 minutes walking through asset disclosure requirements. Harlan was a thorough man who asked careful questions and wrote small, precise notes in the margins of his intake form. When Raymond told him about the Holloway Land Trust, Harlan set his pen down and looked at him for a moment before picking it back up. Raymond transferred his personal checking and savings accounts to a new institution that Thursday. He removed his name from the one joint credit account that remained and notified the bank in writing. He was surgical about it. No drama, no announcement. He simply relocated himself, financially, to ground that was entirely his own. On Sunday, Dominique called to say her mother was making a roast and everyone was gathering. She said it the way she said most things to Raymond now. Not as an invitation, but as information she was passing along, as if he were a neighbor who happened to share the house. He said he would be there. He drove over that evening and sat at the table for 90 minutes. He ate. He watched Bryce Fontenot describe a project he was coordinating in Lafourche Parish, gesturing with his fork, confident and comfortable at a table that Raymond had funded for a decade. He watched Sylvia receive this performance with approval, nodding at the right moments, the perfect audience for the kind of man she had always wished Dominique had chosen. He watched Dominique laugh at something Bryce said, genuine and easy, the laugh he used to know, aimed somewhere else entirely. Raymond said almost nothing. He asked André to pass the bread once. He left before dessert. He shook no hands on his way out. He walked to his truck in the driveway. His truck parked where the black Suburban used to sit, and he drove home through the quiet November dark. He sat in his own home office for a long time after that. He thought about Theodore Holloway, his great-uncle, a man who had worked that land his entire life and left it to Raymond because he believed Raymond would understand its value. He thought about 7 years of weekend surveys in coastal parishes, of courthouse records, and boundary disputes and title defects cleared one by one, of the patience required to build something real when nobody around you believed it existed. He picked up his phone. He typed 3 words to Celeste. Start the clock. He set the phone face down on the desk, turned off the lamp, and went to bed at 10:15. By Wednesday of the following week, Bryce Fontenot's phone would begin ringing with calls he did not yet understand how to answer. Day 3 arrived like a quiet knock on a door that would not open again. The certified letter from the Holloway Land Trust reached Fontenot Golf Partners' registered address on a Wednesday morning. It was addressed to Bryce Fontenot, principal. It informed him, in clean legal language, that the Holloway Land Trust had initiated a comprehensive surface rights review across all affected coastal parcels, effective immediately, and that all ground-level construction activity within the trust boundary was hereby suspended pending resolution. His $67 million subcontract with Crescent Continental was frozen. No work, no billing, no relief. Bryce called Crescent Continental that same afternoon. The project liaison was polite. The project liaison explained that a trustee-initiated surface rights review triggered mandatory suspension under the terms of the primary development agreement. There was nothing Crescent Continental could do until the trustee released the hold. The trustee's name, the liaison noted, was Raymond Holloway. Bryce went very quiet on that call. Day 6, Fontenot Gulf. Partners missed payroll. 2 project managers who had been with the firm for 3 years submitted their resignations by Friday afternoon. They had families, they had mortgages. They could not wait on a legal dispute whose resolution depended on a man who was not returning calls. The Louisiana Business Courier ran a 3-paragraph item that weekend, noting that Fontenot Gulf Partners' Crescent Continental subcontract had been suspended amid a land trust dispute and that the firm's operational status was uncertain. Bryce called Dominique that night. Raymond did not hear what was said. He did not need to. Raymond's phone was ringing by this point. Dominique's name, Sylvia's name, Andre's name, cycling through in rotation like a broken signal. He looked at each one. He set the phone back down. He had said everything he needed to say with a 3-word text on a Sunday night. Day 9 hit the Tureau family like a second wave before the first one had receded. Gulf Merchants, lending the institution holding the commercial property loan on the Tureau building on Poydras Street, conducted its routine monthly title monitoring. Their system flagged the surface rights encumbrance on the St. James Parish guarantee parcel immediately. The flag triggered an automatic compliance review. The compliance review determined that the collateral supporting the loan guarantee had been materially compromised. A margin call notice was issued within 48 hours, $230,000, due in 30 days. Sylvia received the notice at the property office. She called Dominique. Dominique called her attorney. The attorney confirmed what the letter said. They did not have $230,000 liquid. They did not have half that. Then came the detail that broke something open in a different direction entirely. The secondary guarantor documentation surfaced during the lender's file review. Andre Tureau had co-signed a portion of the guarantee 3 years prior in exchange for what he had told Sylvia was a nominal administrative role in the property's management. He had never told his wife. His wife found out when the lender's attorney sent notice to their home address. Andre's phone went silent for 4 days after that. Day 12. Dominique's divorce attorney, a careful woman named Patricia Arsenault, ran standard asset discovery. She had been working from the assumption that the marital estate consisted of a house in Metairie, a modest retirement account, and Raymond's surveying income. What the discovery returned instead was the Holloway Land Trust. 290,000 acres, sole trustee, primary beneficiary, and a development agreement with Crescent Continental Energy valued at $82 billion. Patricia called Dominique and asked her to come in. Dominique sat across from her attorney's desk for 40 minutes. Patricia walked through the numbers carefully, because numbers that large required careful walking. Dominique listened. She did not say much. When she left the office, she sat in her car in the parking garage for a long time before she drove anywhere. Then she called Sylvia. That conversation was loud enough that a neighbor later mentioned it. Day 15. A letter arrived at the Louisiana Coastal Heritage Society's offices on St. Charles Avenue from Crescent Continental Energy's Community Affairs Division. It advised that the annual disbursement of the Coastal Heritage Community Grant, $85,000, the installment that funded the Society's spring programming, was frozen pending receipt of trustee certification from the Holloway Land Trust. The letter noted that certification requests should be directed to the trustee directly. Sylvia received this letter at her desk, in her chairwoman's office, surrounded by the plaques and photographs she had accumulated over 2 decades of social performance. She read it twice. She picked up the phone and called Raymond. He did not answer. Day 18. The Louisiana Social Register, a publication Sylvia had appeared in 11 consecutive years, ran a brief item noting questions about the Coastal Heritage Society's grant funding and whether the spring gala would proceed as planned. Sylvia's board convened an emergency call that same evening. They asked her to explain the funding gap. She could not explain it in any way that helped her. By the end of the call, the board had asked, with the polite but immovable firmness of people protecting an institution, for her resignation. Sylvia Thureau, chairwoman of the Louisiana Coastal Heritage Society for 19 years, was out by nightfall. On the evening of day 18, Dominique called Raymond one final time. The voicemail she left started with anger. Controlled, sharp, the voice of a woman who still believed she had leverage. But it shifted somewhere in the middle, the way voices do when the body finally catches up to what the mind already knows. By the end of it, her voice had lost its shape entirely. She asked him to call her back. She said please. Raymond listened to the voicemail once, all the way through, in his truck in his driveway. Then he called Celeste and asked her to arrange the meeting. Celeste's conference room was on the 4th floor, quiet and grey in the Thursday morning light, with a long table and chairs that did not invite comfort. That was appropriate. Nobody in that room was there to be comfortable. Raymond arrived first. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the credenza, sat down on one side of the table, and waited. He had slept well the night before. He had eaten breakfast. He was not nervous, because nervous was a feeling that belonged to a man who did not know what was coming, and Raymond knew exactly what was coming. Celeste came in next, set her folders in front of her seat, and arranged them with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. She did not say much. She did not need to. Dominique arrived with her attorney, a woman named Patricia Arsenault, who carried herself with the careful composure of a professional preparing for a difficult morning. Dominique sat down across from Raymond and did not look at him directly. She looked at the table. She looked at her attorney. She looked at the window. She was wearing a grey blazer, and her hair was done, and she looked like someone who had put a great deal of effort into appearing as though nothing had broken. Sylvia came in behind them. She had not been invited. Dominique had refused to come without her. Sylvia surveyed the room the way she surveyed every room she entered, as if measuring it against her own standard and finding it acceptable on a provisional basis. She sat beside Dominique without asking where she should sit. She set her purse on the table. Celeste opened the folders and began to present the documentation. She addressed Patricia Arsenault professionally and directly, as one attorney to another, walking through the Holloway Land Trust structure, the Crescent Continental Agreement, and the asset valuation with the even tone of someone reading weather data. Patricia had already seen most of it during discovery. She took notes. She did not interrupt. Sylvia interrupted twice. The first time she questioned the legitimacy of a land trust that nobody in the family had ever heard of, using the particular register of contempt she deployed when she wanted something to disappear by sheer force of dismissal. Celeste responded with the relevant section of Louisiana trust law, the recording date at the Pointe Coupé Parish Courthouse, and the 18-month diligence file number from Crescent Continental's legal division. Sylvia's mouth closed. The second time, Sylvia questioned whether Raymond had the competence to manage an asset of this complexity, given his background. It was a cruel thing to say. It was also the last thing she said for a long time, because Raymond set down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression that was not anger and was not contempt, but was something far more final than either. He let the silence sit for a moment. Then he turned to Dominique. Not to Sylvia, to Dominique, because this had always been about Dominique. He spoke slowly, the way a man speaks when he has rehearsed nothing and means every word. He told her that he remembered the Thanksgiving Sunday clearly. He told her that he remembered the weight of the bucket in his hand, and the sound of the table laughing, and the way she had looked at him when she held it out. Not impulsively, not carelessly, but deliberately, with her eyes level and her smile in place. He told her that he had gone outside and done what she asked, because he was still, at that moment, a man who believed that patience was a form of loyalty. He told her what he had found in the back seat of Bryce Fontenot's Suburban. He described the survey maps. He described the grid lines, the coastal parcel boundaries, the depth notations along the margins. He told her that in the lower left corner of the top map, in his own handwriting, were the boundary notation marks he had developed himself over 20 years of fieldwork, a personal shorthand no other surveyor in Louisiana used. He told her those were his maps, on Bryce's back seat, in his driveway, while Raymond was on his knees washing the man's car. He paused. "You spent 11 years treating me like I was something you were managing down," he said. "You handed me a bucket and pointed at that man's car like 11 years meant nothing. What you didn't know was that the man whose car I washed had my signature on every piece of paper that made him rich, and I hadn't decided yet whether to keep it there." The room was absolutely still. Dominique did not scream. She did not argue. Something behind her eyes simply gave way, quietly, the way a structure gives way when the last load-bearing thing finally goes. She looked at the table. Her hands were folded in front of her, and they did not move. That quiet was worse than anything else she could have done. Then Raymond turned to Sylvia just once, just briefly. He said he remembered the title closing she orchestrated while he was on a job site in St. Mary Parish. He said he had trusted Dominique, and that Sylvia had used that trust as a tool. He said he wanted her to know that he knew exactly what she had done, and that he had known for a long time, and that he had simply been waiting for the appropriate moment. Sylvia opened her mouth. "Raymond has said what he came to say," Celeste said, with the flat authority of a woman ending a meeting. "His attorneys will be in touch regarding the remaining terms." Sylvia started to speak again, something about what the family had provided, what Raymond owed, the years of connection and community and social access that the Tureau name had extended to a man from Pointe Coupée Parish who came to them with nothing. Raymond stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He picked up his coffee cup, carried it to the credenza, and set it down. He looked at Celeste and said, "We're done here." He walked to the conference room door, opened it, and left. He did not look back. The legal proceedings took 4 months. The consequences took considerably longer. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in late March, 4 months after a bucket of soapy water sat beside a garage door in Metairie. Raymond's attorneys handled the settlement with the same surgical precision that had governed everything since that Sunday night text. Dominique received the house. Raymond did not fight it. He had paid for it, built his life in it, and watched his name erased from its deed. And he let her keep it anyway, because he understood something Dominique did not yet fully grasp. The deed encumbrance from the Holloway Trust Surface Rights Review had been formally documented in the parish title records. She could live in that house. She could not sell it. She could not borrow against it. She could not move it, refinance it, or leverage it for anything until she reached a resolution with the Holloway Land Trust. That resolution required Raymond's cooperation. Raymond was done cooperating. Fontenot Gulf Partners dissolved formally 6 weeks after the conference room meeting. Bryce Fontenot filed for business dissolution quietly, with none of the press coverage that had greeted the suspension notice in the Louisiana Business Courier. He returned to working as an individual contractor, smaller projects, smaller parishes, a much smaller truck. The relationship with Dominique ended around the same time the firm did, which surprised no one who understood how that kind of relationship was built. It had been constructed on the image of a man with a $67 million subcontract and a salmon-colored shirt and the ease of someone whose income felt permanent. When the income evaporated, the image went with it. Dominique was left in an encumbered house with a dissolving social life and a mother who could no longer help her. Sylvia's resignation from the Louisiana Coastal Heritage Society was accepted without ceremony. 19 years of chairmanship, 2 decades of spring galas and community grant announcements and society page photographs ended in a brief letter that the board accepted at a special session on a Wednesday evening in January. Sylvia's name disappeared from the society's letterhead within a week. Her social calendar, which had been built around that chairmanship like a wall around a garden, contracted with remarkable speed. The women who had deferred to her for years found other tables. The invitations that had arrived reliably every season stopped arriving. The community that she had built her identity inside of continued without her, indifferently, the way communities always do. Andre's marriage survived, but not without visible damage. The undisclosed guarantee had introduced a question into his household that a guarantee alone could not answer, not about money, but about the kind of man who signs a document and does not tell his wife. That question had a long life. Raymond watched none of this closely. He did not need to. He had moved back to Pointe Coupé Parish by February into a house he built himself on a parcel of Holloway Trust land with a long, clear view of the water. It was a modest house, 3 bedrooms, a deep porch, a workshop off the back where he kept his surveying equipment and his drafting table. He had not needed anything larger. He had not wanted anything larger. He had spent 11 years in a house that was designed to impress people who were never going to be satisfied, and he was finished with that particular architecture. In the spring, he established the Theodore Holloway Foundation. He named it after his great-uncle without ceremony or announcement. The foundation funded land surveying apprenticeships for young men from Pointe Coupé and the surrounding parishes, young men from working families, the kind of families that produced men who showed up early and worked past dark and measured twice before they cut. The first cohort of apprentices started in June. Raymond attended the orientation himself, shook every hand, and told them that the most powerful document in Louisiana was not a contract or a court order. It was a deed. He told them to learn how to read land before anyone else decided to read it for them. He said it plainly, without drama. They understood him. Gloria Marchand had been a public school principal in the parish for 12 years when Raymond moved back. They had known each other growing up. The same church, the same neighborhood rhythms, the same community that Raymond had left when he went to New Orleans and married into a family that spent a decade reminding him he did not belong. Gloria had stayed. She had built something real and unhurried in the place where she came from, and when Raymond came back, she recognized him the way you recognize someone who has finally found their way home. They did not rush anything. They did not need to. They had the particular ease of 2 people who did not have to perform for each other, who asked direct questions and gave direct answers, and sat in comfortable quiet when there was nothing useful to say. On Sunday mornings, Raymond sometimes brought coffee to the porch, and they watched the water together, the light coming in flat and gold across the surface, the parish waking up slowly the way it always had. Raymond Holloway was a man who had spent 11 years being told he was nothing. He had responded by saying nothing, doing his work, and waiting. He had known what he owned before anyone else understood the question. And when the moment came, he had not needed to raise his voice. He had simply stopped extending a cooperation that nobody had thought to value until it was gone. That is the lesson of this story, and it is a simple one. A man who knows what he owns has no reason to announce it. He has every reason to wait. Now it's your turn. What would you have done in Raymond's position? Would you have waited as long as he did? Or would you have acted the moment you walked out of that conference room in Baton Rouge? Drop your answer in the comments. We want to hear from you, and we read every single one. If this story stayed with you, please tap that like button right now. It costs you nothing, and it helps us reach more people who need to hear stories like this one. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the time, because we have more stories coming that you do not want to miss. We will see you in the next one.